Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and Infill Climate Action Forum, and this is one of the webinars we do regularly. And today we're really lucky because we've got Arianna Abdul-Nour with us. Now, Arianna is quite interesting because she's young, and she also is one of the UK youth delegates to COP28, which is going to happen later this year. And that's an incredible thing to be on. So, welcome, Arianna, and thanks for joining me today. And maybe we could start if you could just tell us very briefly, because you could take up all webinar doing this, but if you could just tell us very briefly something about yourself and your background.
Sure. So thanks for having me. My name's Arianna. I'm North London born and bred, Enfield specifically. And I am, as Francis said, I am the COP delegate this year from the UK. My background is actually in international relations. So I studied at the University of Leeds doing politics, philosophy, sociology. And then I went on to do my master's in Norway and in Paris at Sciences Po. In international relations, focusing specifically on migration and human rights. Upon graduating, I then did some work experience in the civil service in the International Department for Trade. And that sort of, the DEFRA, so the Department for Environment and Environmental Affairs, but also Trade. And so that led me on to learning more about our domestic sort of climate policies and how we interact with other countries. And I wanted to sort of bridge that gap between those domestic policies and sort of human rights. And that led me to applying to the Future Leaders Network, which is an NGO that sends 4 people each year, 4 to COP, 4 to the Y7, which is the youth version of the G7, and 4 to the Y20, which is the youth version of the G20.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's pretty comprehensive, and I'm going to talk about the Future Leaders Network in a minute because you can tell us about that. But first of all, I mean, you are very interested and you're very concerned with climate change, and obviously you're concerned because of the studies you've done. But is it something that you feel concerned about because you're young and you fear for your future?
I think what I found is that everything I was studying, so even though my background is international relations, everything is impacted by climate change. So as much as you kind of want to, ignorance is bliss, and especially living in London, we're not sort of, I'm not on the coast, I'm not seeing the direct impacts, or we're not having wildfires yet. It's something you can't ignore, and it's connected with everything. And so I think that initially was sort of, it was an obvious task for me to take on, but as a young person, it's obviously it's a non-negotiable that we have to do our part, because it's our futures ultimately, and our children's futures and our grandchildren. So if we don't take action now, then soon it will become irreversible.
Okay, so you have this commitment and motivation. And you're now the youth delegate to COP28, which is a big step from being, motivated to doing that. I mean, you mentioned the Future Leaders Network, and you got chosen through that. But what process did you have to go through to get chosen to be one of those delegates?
Sure. So the interview stages was, I think, it's threefold. So firstly, I did an application. So the way that they work is they don't want to read your CV, they don't want a covering letter, they don't want to look at your LinkedIn. They sort of want it to be a blind process based on really, your answers to the specific questions. So I think one of the questions was to do with work with, sort of climate or diplomacy that I've carried out before. And so I passed that initial stage. Then I had to do a 5-minute video on any policy that I wanted to do. So I chose the climate tract, but I could have chosen peace and democracy. I could have chosen technology and work or health. And I did mine on climate refugees. So I spoke about how climate change is affecting the refugee population, as it's sort of, that was my background. And that video was then accepted, and I was asked to interview with 2 previous Future Leaders Network alumni, who then offered me the role.
Well, that's pretty impressive, really. Well, it is impressive, but I mean, the Futures Leaders Network, I mean, how did you find out about it? Because it does quite a lot, doesn't it? It isn't just about climate change.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, I think the age range for the Future Leaders Network, I could be wrong, but I think it's maybe 18 to 30, but people tend to be sort of post university just because of, building up that experience takes time. And so I'd actually come across it at university, I think just through curious research. But I sort of didn't think that I was qualified at the time to sort of put myself forward for the role. So I was sort of committed to, over the years, developing that work experience, whether it was in, to do with legal frameworks, to do with human rights, to do with climate, and sort of brought me to a place where I felt comfortable and sort of qualified enough to apply, and it worked out well.
Well, it did work out well, and obviously the age is 18 to 30, so I don't think I'm going to make it, but you clearly did. I mean, one of your aims, isn't it, well, there is to write a communique on climate change from a youth perspective. Have you started to do that yet? And what ideas do you have that you think should go into it?
Yes. So one of the big things is the whole point is that we're the voice of young people. So we want to make sure that although we're doing the research, that our communique is informed by young people, their needs and their wants. So we've sent out a survey which effectively kind of pilots and asking young people what they believe their priorities are. So we have specific breakdowns, and we sort of formulated an initial policy brief which includes the different themes, so including fossil fuels, climate finance, carbon pricing, agriculture, transport. And this was our sort of broader capture of it. But we recently attended SB58 in Bonn, in Germany in June. And having gone there, we've now sort of revised these initial policy proposals. As sort of Bonn is, they talk about it as the nerdy COP. So it's all the sort of behind the scenes for COP, establishing what the agenda will be, what the themes will be. And we learned a lot about what the big topics are this year and what the UK's priorities are. And so are trying to adjust our policy priorities according to the sort of world spectrum, but also making sure that it's still informed by young people. So bridging the gap between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you saying you went to Bond, and it'd be interesting to know what made you change your priorities, because I looked at some of their priorities, and obviously they have ones like loss and damage, which I'm sure, given your own academic background, you think about strongly, but it had things like just transition, which has not been thought about very seriously until fairly recently. I mean, did you start to reassess your own views when you went to Bond?
We did, and a big part of that is because, we have a communique and we don't want to sort of throw loads and loads of different policies at the government. So if effectively, we're going to whittle it down to 4 priorities that we want to submit. And with that, you want to make them realistic. As much as you want to be ambitious and you want to, end all fossil fuels by 2024, it's not realistic in terms of an ask from the UK government. And so what we realized is, there are a lot of barriers to pushing forward with certain things. And so the sort of slow bureaucracy that we saw at Bonn, we know that will be the case at COP. So it's important to have really specific wording and policies that also, develop on from previous years. So recently they introduced the climate clubs as of COP27, which was a German initiative, and they wanted to effectively kind of create this shared resource, shared knowledge about the climate. And so that's something that we're thinking to pioneer, just because we think that's really important, sharing these resources and knowledge around the world in order to for countries to help each other. But also we know that it's something that worldwide and domestically the UK has spoken about. So it's something that has traction and can gain momentum. Whereas like I said, if it's a really, really ambitious policy, you need to be wary about how realistic it's going to be in practicality. So loss and damage, as you said, is a big thing, and that's something that we're focusing on.
when you've done it and you've completed it, I mean, where will that communique go? And do you think people will listen to it or read it?
Sure. So we're directly linked to the government. So we are in sort of communication with the UK government team who work with COP. And we sort of have it's an informal arrangement because we are not necessarily the official informants. They have their team. They don't have an official young team whose policies are are adopted 100%, but they use us as to sort of do the background research, and then they can either decide to adopt or sort of take into account the things that we've said. So we write the communique, we send it to the government, and they and it's not just sort of they reject it, because throughout the year we're working with them to make sure our policies are aligning. So if it's feeding into the UK government, who will then feed it into COP.
But you said earlier that you're getting used to the slow bureaucracy, or it is slow. And I mean, have you got used to that? And have you got used to the sense that politicians probably may have different views than younger people? I mean, is that something you have to come to terms with?
Yeah, I think the beauty of the role is that we don't just work with governments, we also work with young people, different NGOs, different stakeholders. And so our echo chamber is particularly positive because it's all sort of similar ambitious people working in the same field that they're passionate about. But when it comes to the higher level policy decision making, as I said, I've worked in the civil service and it's very slow. You have to go through several layers to get it adopted, and then they might I think it was in COP26, Alok Sharma, sort of there was a wording on getting rid of coal, and because there was a technicality with the wording, I think India rejected it because it they were able to sort of kind of manipulate it in a sense. And so it's slow with that respect the higher up you get. But I think we're quite positive based upon the people we've spoken to and how committed they are to sort of net zero, below 1.5, and all the different sort of Paris Agreement texts that have been established in 2015. So we're positive, but we're realistic in the same regard. So we know that there are obstacles when it comes to COP.
But you also, a part of what you're doing is to identify policies that resonate with young people.
Exactly.
When you talk to young people, your own generation, I mean, are they different from politicians or older people or people in bureaucracies? What is it that resonates with young people in the climate change agenda?
Yeah, it's a good point, because it sort of does seem to manifest slightly differently. I think young people are almost more hopeful, ironically, because they kind of see the sort of Gretas of the world who have really pioneered and paved the way to make a difference. And I think, while policy and all these more official forms are really important, I think young people see agency in activism and social media and sort of campaigning in different ways that isn't necessarily the slow bureaucracy that perhaps the older generation are used to and perhaps have succumbed to as sort of the only way to have influence. And so I think from my perspective, young people are able to sort of exercise their agency more than perhaps the previous generation was, with the use of digital media and activism forums and networks. And I think that it allows them to feel like they're a bigger part of the change, as opposed to just leaving it to policymakers.
Being a bigger part of the change is important, but when you see groups like our own, which is a network of a lot of organizations, we try to work in a networking way rather than a committee or group way, but we still have meetings with a lot of older people there. And committee meetings sometimes can get terribly boring, even for me. And, that is a problem in involving young people on those sort of initiatives. How can we create an intergenerational approach that encompasses everyone?
So is that an intergenerational approach to sort of just working with the climate movement in general, or policy, or what specifically?
Well, let's start with working with the climate movement, because obviously when we have meetings, young people don't necessarily come, and you hear that with lots of groups. I mean, not just climate change. It's an issue that, I mean, I understand, because when I was younger, I didn't particularly want to mix with committees with older people, and so I know. So we have to have an intergenerational approach, which actually makes people act and behave in different ways, in the ways that's appropriate to them. But how do we bring that all together?
Yeah, I think it's, it's a good question. It's a difficult one because, as I think we were saying before in the previous meeting that we had with the community, you were sort of saying, why aren't there more young people on the call? And I think with young people, one thing is, sort of moving around a lot. You don't necessarily have the same ties to the community as when you're fixed, and when you're older and you're sort of more settled. And so I think it's about creating that sense of community that's inclusive of everyone. So when you have, excuse me, when you have these meetings, it's about outreach. So it's about making sure that young people are aware that they exist, but also catering to that generation. So having perhaps a different approach to climate change that's more engaging, as opposed to more sort of bureaucratic discussion, is excuse me, is really important. And I think, as I was saying about on a broader level, as I was saying with the climate clubs that was discussed last year, one of our policy suggestions was creating a youth climate club, so that young people are informed and feel like that they're contributing, and they're making their voices are being heard. And so having sort of the young and the old bridging the gap between their respective sort of priorities and policies is really important, because it's important for the older generation to understand what's concerning us, but also for us to understand what's concerning the older generation. And the older generation is far more experienced with, you sort of witnessed firsthand the climate changing from 50 years ago, and so we have a lot to learn from the older generation, but they also have a lot to learn from young people. So it's that shared knowledge is really important, and it's about making it engaging and impactful, making it feel like you're actually making a change, as opposed to just talking about talking.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I guess we tried to do it is we got some young people from sixth forms who formed an NCAF youth, and we got them to do the sort of webinars I'm doing now. We got them to interview the shadow minister. We got them to interview local MPs and so on. So that's something you think young people will be interested. They've got decision makers in front of them. Let's get at them. Let's ask our questions.
I think it's important for young people to feel important and like they have a say in a platform. And so if the older generation are able to facilitate that and provide them with a place that they have a voice, that they feel like they're able to contribute to their community or the broader global community, then they'll feel more inspired to continue on the work.
You mentioned local conference for youth the last time we spoke to you. Is that something that could be used, for example, to engage young people locally?
Yes, definitely. So just to develop on that, we've been chosen from the UK to develop the local conference of youth, which effectively is we create this sort of we're doing a hybrid one, so an online one, but also an in-person one, and we sort of bring young people and people from the older generation together to discuss, to create workshops and discuss priorities, worries, concerns, ambitions about the climate movement and the climate crisis, that we can then feed back into our communique, into the different stakeholders and ministers that we're speaking to. And so I think these spaces and these environments are really important to foster, as I said before, this shared knowledge, sharing of resources, and establishing a sort of sense of community and togetherness in the fight against climate change.
I mean, is that something we could develop locally with someone like yourself and link it in with NCAF, and then see if that involves young people, because then they have a forum of their own, but they're intergenerationally linked with other groups as well?
Definitely. And I think the thing with Alcoy is it will attract people who are already interested in the environment. Whereas if you work on a smaller scale with Enfield or another community, and you engage schools, you're sort of engaging young people who perhaps don't know much about it or aren't initially that interested, and educating them and giving them a voice to be included in the conversation. So I think it's really important to do that outreach on a smaller scale, with the schools and the local community and young people who are equally important in the movement as Greta and the big climate ministers and all these other stakeholders. So I think that's really important.
I mean, and is it important to try and link things together? I mean, for example, the United Nations Association, we have a local branch here. And I know that you actually went on a peace boat to Central America. Maybe you can tell us what that is. But doing that sort of involves a local group here, which then also is about climate change, because how coastal communities are affected. So it relates to NCAF as well. So that linking up is quite important, isn't it?
It is. I think it is, like I said, sort of bridging these different, sections of knowledge and resources, really important. I can sort of develop a little bit more about Peace Boat if you'd like me to sort of expand on this point. So about a month ago, I returned from Peace Boat, which is an international NGO working to promote peace, human rights, and sustainability. So I was chosen, I was one out of 13 people who were chosen from over 600 people to get this scholarship to travel around Panama, Guatemala, and Mexico. And my other sort of peers, my other scholars, they were from all different parts of the world. So one was from Trinidad and Tobago, one was from Panama, one was from France, and it was incredible to sort of go around and see firsthand the effects of climate change on these communities in Latin America. So many of them were coastal communities who were being affected by climate change. And I learned so much from the communities, but also from these different, young people from their respective countries. I learned so much about where they were from, the challenges they're facing, and the tools that they need in order to defend themselves against a sort of wrath of climate change. And so that was a really, really important lesson for me that I've brought back, is that sort of sense of community and fostering of knowledge. And I think that doesn't need to be on such an international scale. It's important that it's done within the local community too.
Yeah, I mean, when we talked to the local communities, Muslim communities in Palmer's Green Mosque, and when we talked to the Windrush people, they said, look, if you're going to get our communities involved in climate change, you've got to look at what's happening to our parent and grandparent communities back in where they came from. And so the global thing has got to become very local. Is that an important thing we need to understand?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it starts with your community, I think, any change. And it's really difficult to, I was super fortunate that I was able to go on the Peace Boat, or that I've been able to travel with my work. But, that's not the nature of most people's work. And it doesn't mean that it should stop you from sharing that knowledge, trying to make a change. And so, like I said, it starts from community. I'm forever faithful to my roots. I'm, like I said, Enfield born and bred. And for me, it's really important to make sure that on the ground we're making those changes, because that has such a domino knock-on effect to making some real change in the sort of global sphere.
Okay, well, you're obviously full of energy and passion. But I mean, and you've also learned, because you've been in the civil service and so on, and you've been working with groups and committees, so you know how to work through a system, you're beginning to understand bureaucracy. But what about young people generally? Do you think that they have a sense of despondency about their future, or apathy? Or do you think there's an optimism that they still think there is time to make a difference?
I think it's a mixed bag, for sure. A lot of people, apathetic. They're not. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind, for a lot of people, because, like I said, living in London, it doesn't feel so real. and things in the media can seem quite far removed. And so for a lot of people, it's kind of just like, oh, it's not my problem. It's someone else's problem, or it's the problem isn't as big as we say it is. For people more in my echo chamber with respect to climate change and human rights, I think they feel a great sense of momentum because, as I said, that we're around a lot of young people who have similar passions and who want to make a change. And so we feel like it's not too late. But actually speaking to a lot of, the older generation at Bonn, and sort of different people involved there, I think they're a lot more despondent because perhaps they maybe been in the game longer and feel like it's as I said, it's a slow process, and change, something drastic needs to happen, which perhaps hasn't happened so imminently before, but needs to now. And I think because we're kind of new to the game, and we're sort of optimistic that change can be sort of carried out faster than it has in the past. I think we're very positive that it's not too late. And like I said, it's not irreversible yet. We are at the point of sort of global warming, as Antonio Guterres said, but we're not global boiling rather. But we're not boiled yet. We're not done. So with plenty of work to do, and we still have time.
Yeah, I was going to say boiled was the word he used, which is just a bit higher than warming. Okay, so young people may feel like that, but the problem is they work through either dictatorships in some countries, or they work through a parliamentary system where the MPs are more concerned on winning the next election than they are on long-term changes, because the long-term doesn't affect their immediate election. We've seen that with the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition today, where they've been either sort of making negative remarks about net zero, or they've been sort of not clinging back, but going back on some of their own commitments. Do you think young people have any faith in the parliamentary system now, or do they feel it's time to take to the streets?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of despondency around our own UK government, just because, I think the Tories haven't necessarily proved themselves to be, the best eco warriors. And the way that the government works is the ministers switch around. So you might be Minister of Health one week and next you're Minister of the Environment, and that doesn't seem very, for any other job you have to have a breadth of experience in that particular sector, but for the government they seem sort of exempt from that rule, and anyone can kind of be Minister of Environment, which is quite terrifying. And Rishi is I listened to a recent interview with him about talking about flying on his private jet, and he was really ignorant to the he was like, if people want to go on holiday, they can go on holiday, which wasn't the point of the call. He kind of avoided the question and manipulated it, which is often the way. But I recently attended a talk with Greta Thunberg at the Conduit in London, and a few other climate activists who had previously been outside the Ministry of Energy to campaigning against the Rosebank venture. And so I think it can feel sort of like young people versus the government versus perhaps some of the older generation, which is a shame, because as I said, it's really important for those partnerships to overlap in order to make any tangible change. So yeah, I think there is definitely despondency with the government, but that's not to say it's all of the government, but the progress, it needs to be progress, it needs to not backtrack us.
Okay, so given the optimism you have, and I'm glad to say I still have it too, do you think locally we might be able to involve more young people by using climate clubs, or looking at the youth forum, the local conference for youth, and we could find some way of bringing them together? How do you think we might be able to do that?
Sure, I definitely think that's very feasible and a very, very good idea. As I said, it's important to, I think, use local schools, so engage young people that perhaps don't necessarily have an interest in it or don't know much about it. If they're younger and they don't have access to social media or read the news, it's maybe ignorance is bliss in that sense. And so I think it's really important to do that outreach, not just to, people in the climate activism sphere, but also just young people in schools or the different networks that exist in Enfield or other communities. And so I think that outreach is really important, and expanding the NCAP or any other communities kind of network in order to show people that you're there, and show people that you're kind of willing to work together for this agenda is really important, because it's about kind of putting us all on the same level, because we're all working towards the same thing at the end of the day.
Okay, well, we've sort of come to the end of our 30 minutes now. So, let me ask you, if anybody wanted to know more about what you do or how to get in touch, or even with the youth delegates, how would they do it? How would they go about it?
Sure. I mean, personally, I'm very happy for anyone to reach out. So I can, I don't know how I can give out my email, but if anyone wants that, I'm very happy to do that. Francis can perhaps pass it on. You can find me on LinkedIn, Arianna Abdul-Nour. I'm happy to sort of ask any climate related questions, any sort of Future Leaders Network delegation questions, anything. And I think there's lots of different kind of, especially sort of volunteering climate organizations like Youngo, like Climate Talk, that people can get involved in. It doesn't have to be a full-time job. It can just be 1 hour a week doing your part, and I think that's really important. So yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And you sort of opened the door to people to, speak to you now about what you're doing, which is great. But I mean, I think what you're doing is fantastic. I think your energy and your passion it just comes over. It projects out. So, I think it's been really inspiring to listen to you, not just for young people, but people of different generations as well, because when you do the things you do, it gives us hope as well. And I think that's really, really important and encouraging for us. So, thank you very much for doing this interview, Arianna. And I wish you good luck in all the things you're doing in the coming year. Anyhow.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And we'll end this webinar now.